Have you ever prayed with all your heart, only to feel as though your words vanished into empty space? You've cried out for healing, for guidance, for peace, and yet silence. And then, another time, perhaps in a moment of quiet surrender, with no words at all, something happened. The answer came, the burden lifted, and you felt an invisible presence move within you. Why does this happen? Why do some prayers seem to open heaven's doors, while others echo back unanswered? The truth is, it has nothing to do with how long we pray, how perfectly we speak, or even how strong our faith seems. It has everything to do with consciousness, with where we are praying from. Goldsmith once said, "Prayer is not asking God for things, but realizing God as the source and substance of all." When we pray from separation, we reach for something distant. But when we pray from I am, from the awareness that the divine already lives within us, the prayer itself becomes the answer. Today, let's explore why some prayers work and others don't, and how understanding the truth of I am transforms prayer from words into living power. Would you like me to continue this into a transition paragraph leading into your first key point? The misunderstanding of prayer. Most of us begin our spiritual journey with a certain idea of what prayer is: a way to reach God, to ask for something we feel is missing, or to plead for help in moments of suffering. It's a deeply human impulse. We grow up hearing that if we ask sincerely enough, if we use the right words, or show the right amount of faith, something out there will hear us and respond. Yet, this approach, though sincere, is built on a quiet misunderstanding, the belief that God is somewhere else, and that prayer is our attempt to bridge the distance. The very act of asking implies that the divine is apart from us. It suggests separation, that there is a me here and a God somewhere over there. But the truth, as mystics like Goldsmith revealed, is that there is no such distance. God is not external. God is consciousness itself, the very awareness in which the prayer is being spoken. When we pray to God, we unconsciously affirm that separation. And when we do, the prayer, no matter how emotional or passionate, lacks the foundation of realization necessary for it to bear fruit. True prayer does not reach outward, it moves inward. It's not about persuading a higher power, but awakening to the presence already within. Imagine standing before a mirror and asking your reflection to give you life. It sounds absurd, yet that's precisely what we do when we pray, as though God were outside of us. The reflection can only show what already is. Prayer, in its truest form, is not a plea for change. It's an act of recognition, recognizing that the divine, the creative source of all life, is expressing itself right where we are. This understanding changes everything. Once we shift from I am praying to God to God is expressing through me, we move from struggle to surrender, from effort to awareness. It is the difference between trying to summon light into a room and simply realizing that the light switch has been on all along. When you see that you are not separated from the source, you stop trying to get something from it, because you realize you already are it in expression. That is why so many prayers fail. They are not rejected, they are simply misdirected. They are attempts to speak to what is, in truth, the listener itself. The universe does not respond to words, but to consciousness. Words may inspire us, but realization transforms us, and only realization can make prayer effective. When the mind finally grows quiet enough to sense the living presence within, prayer ceases to be an act. It becomes a state of being. It becomes communion. And in that communion, the distinction between one who prays and the one who answers dissolves entirely. So perhaps the question is not whether God hears our prayers, but whether we are awake enough to hear God's silence, because in that silence lies the only answer that was ever needed. If we look closely at the way most of us have been taught to pray, we'll notice something subtle but profound. It's almost always a petition. We ask for health, for supply, for peace, for guidance. We speak words into the silence, hoping that someone, somewhere, is listening. But true prayer, as Goldsmith so beautifully expressed, is not the act of asking, it is the realization of being. It is not communication in the ordinary sense, it is communion, a state of awareness where the mind is quiet and the soul is attuned to the infinite within. When prayer is approached as petition, it implies lack. It says, I don't have what I need, but if I ask hard enough, perhaps I'll receive it. The mind that prays in this way is affirming absence, and the law of consciousness responds in kind. We receive according to what we are conscious of being. So, when we pray from a sense of lack, we reinforce that very lack. The mind says, I need healing, and consciousness replies, yes, you are one who needs healing. The prayer becomes self-perpetuating, an endless circle of asking without receiving. But in communion, something very different occurs. Communion is not about words, nor thoughts, nor effort. It is a listening stillness, a resting in the awareness that God is already here. You could say it's not the act of praying to God, but the awareness as God. Not in the sense of personal divinity or ego, but in the recognition that the divine life is the only life there is, and that life is expressing through you. When you reach this inner stillness, you're no longer trying to make something happen. You're allowing what already is to reveal itself. This kind of prayer cannot fail because it does not attempt to get anything. It simply reveals what has always been true. You don't need to convince the ocean to reflect the sky. You only need still water. In the same way, you don't need to convince God to bless you. You only need stillness of mind for that blessing to be visible. The prayer that works is not the one filled with emotion or repetition. It's the one in which human will is silent enough for divine will to be known. And this silence is not empty. It's alive, vibrant with awareness. The moment we enter it, something shifts inwardly. There's a release, a subtle realization that everything we sought was never missing. Healing begins to flow, clarity emerges, peace dawns, not because we forced anything, but because we aligned with what has always been true. So real prayer is not measured by how long we speak or how earnestly we ask, but by how deeply we listen. The words may open the door, but only silence lets us enter. And that's the paradox. The most powerful prayers are often the ones never spoken. Because in the stillness where words fall away, we discover that what we were seeking has been quietly present all along. At the heart of every genuine spiritual realization lies a simple yet immeasurably profound truth: I am. Those two words are not personal. They are not tied to an individual identity or human personality. They are the living expression of divine being itself. When Moses asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" the answer that came was not a name, not a form, but pure being. I am Chad, I am. This was not a statement of theology but of consciousness, a revelation that God is not a distant power to be reached, but the very essence of awareness itself. When we pray, the power of that prayer depends entirely on the level of consciousness from which it arises. If we pray as a person trying to reach something higher, we affirm duality. But when we pray from the awareness of I am, we begin to realize that there is only one life, one mind, one presence expressing through us. This is not a belief to accept intellectually. It's a living realization that shifts the entire foundation of prayer. The ordinary human approach to prayer starts with a sense of need. I want, I lack, I hurt. But every one of those statements carries the subtle vibration of separation. I am sick implies that wholeness is elsewhere. I am poor suggests that abundance is outside of me. I am afraid declares that peace has been lost. Yet when you consciously return to I am, you dissolve the illusion behind those beliefs. You no longer pray for health. You recognize that the life of God, which is health itself, is the very substance of your being. You no longer pray for supply. You realize that divine sufficiency flows as your life continuously. You no longer pray for peace. You become still enough to feel that peace is already the background of your existence. Joel Goldsmith often said, "We do not pray to change God's will. We pray to awaken to it." And that awakening happens the moment we shift from identifying ourselves as human beings striving for divine help to recognizing ourselves as divine consciousness appearing as human form. The I am within us is not a small personal spark. It is the infinite individualized. It's the recognition that there is nothing to add, nothing to fix, nothing to reach for, only to realize. The transformative power of I am lies in this realization. Whatever follows those words becomes the law of your being. If you say, I am limited, you affirm limitation. But if you silently know, I am infinite being, you align with the truth that dissolves all boundaries. Prayer, then, is not about asking God to come closer, but about letting go of every false belief that you were ever apart. When you pray from I am, the answer is not delayed, it's instant, because the prayer and the fulfillment are one. The recognition itself is the healing, the peace, the supply. So, when you speak the words I am, pause and feel their weight. They are not about who you are as a person, they are about what God is as you. And when that truth becomes living awareness, you will find that there is no longer a prayer to be made, only a presence to be lived. If we are honest with ourselves, we must admit that many of our prayers arise from fear. We pray when we are in trouble, when the future feels uncertain, or when we are desperate for something to change. And while there is sincerity in that longing, there is also an unseen barrier built into it. When prayer is born out of fear or need, it carries within it a vibration of separation, the quiet but powerful belief that something essential is missing and that God must now intervene to supply it. That belief, subtle as it may be, is what prevents prayer from bearing fruit. It is not that God withholds, but that we have unconsciously closed the channel through which grace flows, the channel of spiritual awareness. Joel Goldsmith often taught that prayer fails not because the divine is unwilling, but because the human mind insists on directing the process. We bring our desires, our personal will, our anxieties, and then try to shape the outcome according to what we think is best. But the moment we do this, we've stepped outside the realm of true prayer and into the realm of mental projection. We are no longer communing with divine intelligence. We are bargaining with our own imagination. And as long as we are trying to control the outcome, we are affirming the false sense of self, the I, that believes it must make something happen. Real prayer, the kind that transforms, begins when the personal self grows quiet. It begins when we surrender the urge to dictate and instead open ourselves to the awareness of divine will. Surrender does not mean resignation or passivity. It means releasing the limited human sense of what should be so that the infinite wisdom of what is can reveal itself. There is a vast difference between asking for peace and entering the silence where peace already abides. Think of it this way: fear and faith cannot occupy the same consciousness. One excludes the other. When we pray from fear, we are affirming faith in appearances, faith in sickness, lack, or conflict. But when we pray from stillness, from that inner knowing of I am, we are affirming faith in the invisible harmony that underlies all things. Then, instead of trying to change appearances, we allow the truth behind them to unfold naturally. The hidden barrier that blocks so many prayers is not God's absence, it's our mental noise, the restless activity of thought that never stops talking long enough to listen. When that noise subsides, grace flows of its own accord. We do not make it flow, we simply become aware that it was flowing all along. So the next time you feel compelled to pray, pause first. Ask yourself, am I praying from fear, or from realization, from wanting or from knowing? That single shift, from trying to get something to letting God be what already is, can turn an unanswered prayer into living communion. Because in truth, every prayer is answered the moment it is spoken, but only when it's spoken from the consciousness that knows there is nothing left to ask for. There comes a point in every sincere seeker's journey when prayer itself begins to change form. At first, we pray because we feel the need to ask, to reach out for guidance, for protection, for the fulfillment of something we lack. But gradually, as consciousness deepens, we begin to realize that the act of asking implies that the thing we seek is missing. And in truth, nothing of God can ever be missing. This realization marks the quiet but revolutionary shift from asking to knowing, from petition to awareness. To ask is human, to know is divine. When we pray by asking, we are still engaging the mind, the personal self that believes it must somehow make contact with a distant power. But the moment we move into knowing, we step out of thought and into being. We are no longer striving to reach the divine, we are resting in the awareness that the divine is already expressing through us. This is the point at which prayer ceases to be a mental act and becomes a state of consciousness. Joel Goldsmith described this beautifully when he said that prayer is not something we do to God, but something God does as us. When we shift from asking to knowing, we stop trying to shape reality and begin to witness it. We no longer pray for peace, we abide in peace. We no longer ask for healing, we know that divine life, which is perfect wholeness, is already functioning through every cell of our being. The results that follow are not miracles in the conventional sense. They are simply the natural outworking of spiritual law once consciousness aligns with truth. Think of the difference between one who looks at a dark room and pleads for light, and one who calmly reaches for the switch. The first is asking, the second is knowing. The first operates from fear, the second from realization. And in spiritual practice, this shift changes everything. Because when we know, we stop giving reality to appearances. We no longer affirm sickness, limitation, or discord. We recognize them as shadows cast by the belief in separation. The moment that belief dissolves, harmony reappears, not because we made it happen, but because it was never gone. This is why true prayer is silent, effortless, and immediate. It's not an act of persuasion, it's an awakening to what already is. The instant we rest in that knowing, the outer conditions of our life begin to rearrange themselves in perfect correspondence with inner awareness. It is not that God suddenly begins to act. It is that we have finally stopped resisting divine action. And so, the real art of prayer lies not in mastering words, but in mastering stillness. To know is to trust that the infinite mind, I am, within has already gone before you in every situation. When that knowing becomes your resting place, prayer and fulfillment are no longer two separate experiences. They are one. The next time you pray, don't ask for the light. Be still, and know that you already are the light. When we begin to understand the true nature of prayer, something subtle but transformative happens. We stop treating prayer as an isolated act and begin to recognize it as a continuous state of awareness. In the early stages of spiritual development, we often think of prayer as something we do, a practice, a discipline, a sacred moment set aside for communion with the divine. But as consciousness unfolds, we come to realize that prayer is not limited to those moments of silence or devotion. It is the very awareness through which we live, move, and have our being. This is what Joel Goldsmith referred to as living prayer. It means carrying that inner stillness and realization into every aspect of daily life. True prayer doesn't begin when you close your eyes, and it doesn't end when you open them. It is not confined to a sacred space or a specific time. It is the continuous recognition that the presence you commune with in silence is the same presence guiding your words, your work, your relationships, and your very breath. When prayer becomes life, you no longer reach for God, you express God. The beauty of this realization lies in its simplicity. You don't need to withdraw from the world to live in prayer. You simply need to remain aware of the divine center within you, even as you go about ordinary tasks, washing dishes, speaking to a friend, sitting in traffic. All become opportunities to stay aligned with the inner stillness that is God in expression. You're no longer reacting to life, you're responding from consciousness. You begin to see that everything you encounter, every challenge, every joy, is part of the same divine unfoldment that your moments of silence reveal. This is where the boundaries between the sacred and the ordinary dissolve. There is no spiritual life separate from daily life. There is only life, and it is divine. When we live in that awareness, prayer stops being an effort to reach upward and becomes an effortless awareness flowing outward. It is not about invoking blessings, but recognizing that the blessing is already present in every moment we inhabit consciously. And here's the quiet miracle: when prayer becomes your natural state, your life itself becomes the answer. You no longer pray for harmony because your consciousness radiates harmony. You no longer pray for abundance because you live in the awareness of divine sufficiency. You no longer pray for peace because your presence becomes peace for others. Living prayer is not achieved through willpower or spiritual technique. It unfolds as we continually return to that inner recognition: I and the Father are one. It is a way of living in constant remembrance that God is not something to reach for, but the essence of what we already are. So as you move forward, let your prayer continue beyond words and silence. Let it breathe through your actions, your stillness, your kindness, and your awareness. Because in the end, the highest form of prayer is not spoken, it is lived.